everyone, and welcome back. It is finally time that I get to show you the full, historically accurate Maleficent ensemble put together. There are some bits and pieces that I need to finish up first, but I hope that you are just as excited to see it all put together as I am. I have not actually seen it yet. The filming for that will be this afternoon, and I cannot wait to actually see what weeks and weeks of work look like put all together. So incredibly excited. Like I said, there are a few bits and pieces that I have to finish up first, which includes me trying to understand what in the world the accessories were in the early 15th century that should go with ensemble like that. And on that note, I do want to go a little bit more in depth as to why I am doing early 15th century Maleficent and not early 14th century Maleficent like the movie states. The thing is, movies today aren't overly concerned with being perfectly historically accurate, and that was even less the case in the 1950s, and even less the case when we're talking about an animated movie, and even less the case when we're talking about a fairy tale. So while they clearly did a lot of heavy image research in order to put this movie together, they weren't concerned with it being set in a specific year or decade. They just had a general feel. And so you will see clothing that was worn in the 14th century and the 15th century throughout the film on all sorts of different people, because that was what people had imagery of as standard medieval clothing. There's a mix. They weren't concerned with keeping it specific to the 14th century. So that left me with the choice, because Maleficent's ensemble is clearly inspired by images of early 15th century garments, of the large houppelande style, of the double hannons, or possibly the butterfly hannons that we talked about in the last video. So they were using those as inspiration. And it would require me to make a lot of changes to her entire silhouette, all of the details in her ensemble, her type of headdress, in order to place it in the 14th century. And from the fact that the line is basically, it's the 14th century now, we gotta keep up with the times. It's not late 14th century, we're not talking 1390 here, we're talking probably early 1300s. So that's gonna be a 100-year difference. Clothing is drastically different. And if they weren't concerned with it being set in a specific year, I feel like I would have to make too many dramatic changes to the costume for it to even look like Maleficent anymore. So I chose not to do that. I wanted to keep it true to the character and the images that they were inspired by, not true to the exact year as stated. So that was why that choice was made. So with that in mind, I want to start digging into the different accessories and parts that are really necessary to complete the ensemble, such as the belt, the hose. I've already made the shoes back in December, and there's a whole video about that, but I will briefly touch on those today. I like to go into things like the kirtle in a little bit more detail, and can't, obviously, forget about her staff. That is an essential part of Maleficent's character, so I can't just not do that, even if I have no idea what I'm doing in that realm. But we'll get to that. But first, I want to say a really big thank you to this video's sponsor for the week, Audible.com. Audible.com has thousands of audiobooks available, not to mention other audio entertainment like podcasts and theatrical programs. I am constantly adding to my list of titles far faster than I can manage to listen to them all. For me, it's the perfect way to learn or escape while I'm working around my studio. There will always be more that I want to discover than I have time for, but Audible just makes it that much easier. Lately, I've been working my way through the hidden lives of Tudor women. So often the history we've learned has been full of big names and even bigger achievements, but this forgets the majority of people that existed and impacted the world around them. I love that Elizabeth Norton digs into material culture and everyday lives of so many different women that made up the Tudor era. I also can't wait to get back to women's work by Elizabeth Wayland Barber, which has been one of my favorite titles and I return to constantly, unpacking the history behind the textile trades. Honestly, I could go on for hours about the variety of amazing titles I would recommend, and right now you can get a 30-day free trial to explore their catalog. Just visit audible.com/NicoleR or text NicoleR to 500-500 to get started. Audible.com gives me the time I thought I didn't have. It moves through my studio and my house with me as I work. If you're looking for a way to fit more adventure, learning, or exploration into your life, go to audible.com/NicoleR or text NicoleR to 500-500 to start your free trial today. Thanks again to audible.com for sponsoring this video and allowing me to do all of this hefty research that I did this week on things as minor as belts. Because wow, is there a lot of information to try and put together for some of these pieces. Like I said, one of the first things that I really got started on was the belt. Now, belts of the 15th century that typically go with houppelande are very similar to the belts that go with Burgundian gowns in the latter part of the century. They are very wide, they have massive buckles, they sometimes have decor all around them, they have long hanging ends that also have this giant metal piece on the end sometimes. They're just impressive. I managed to find a place that produces castings of that type of buckle, armor and castings, and I ordered one of their Burgundian belt buckles, as they call it, and all of the little pieces that need to go with it in order to make this. The choice then was, what is this going to be made out of? Because you do find evidence of them having leather versions as well as textile versions. So some of these surviving examples are out of a gold brocade ribbon of sorts. It's woven specifically for that. Others seem to have evidence of some velvet being used or other sorts of heftier tapes and woven items. Like I said, leather is another option. So I had a whole variety of choices when it came to textiles in theory. In practice, it came down to what I could actually find that was for sale still today, because obviously they have a lot of things that we don't anymore, and I don't necessarily want to put that much weight, wear, and tear on an antique piece of fabric or ribbon. I don't think it's going to hold up to it. So I had to choose something that I had in textile form in order to get the right width, and in order to get something that I thought was going to be sturdy enough in order to hold up to these buckles, which, spoiler alert, I don't think my choice was, so I'm gonna go back and redo that someday. But that's sort of my tip on this one. You need something really hard and sturdy. Even if you have to go searching far and wide for it, I recommend making sure that you have something that is going to hold up to the weight. The hose, I had previously made a pair and was able to use the pattern off of those, but I'm still going to talk about how I came up with that pattern and how I actually put those together. Hose of this era are made out of fabric rather than being a knitted stocking. Now that's not because we didn't have knitting as an option, we did. Knitting was around in Europe by the 15th century. It was thoroughly ensconced. You can find lots of examples of knitted goods like gloves or hats or even jackets and some stockings. However, it takes a long time to knit a pair of stockings, and it takes a long time for you to go through the actual apprenticeship and training to learn how to make all of these knitted goods, because yes, it was a trade. It was a male-dominated trade at that. So knitting was not something that was necessarily all over the place, commonly done in the home by absolutely everybody. Everybody just sat around knitting stockings. They take a long time. Why would you take that time to knit a pair of stockings by hand when you can just sit down, cut out a pair of hose, seam them up in just a couple of hours? You can make multiple pairs a day really fast, really cheap by comparison when you think of the sheer number of hours it takes to actually put the labor in. So that's why hose are really popular up until the late 16th century when the knitting machine came in. And suddenly everything changed and knitting became much faster. It was a massive turnover in the industry. And suddenly we have knit stockings being more of the norm than something that is a way to show off your wealth, because you have something so large that took so much time with grand designs knitted in or embroidered on. Now, hose is just a really fast, easy process, and it makes sense why they kept doing that up until the knitting machine came along. So I'm making mine out of a twill wool because I think this is the right place to use that sort of strange green color that you start to see in a lot of Maleficent's backgrounds and effects. So I'm making a sort of olive green pair of hose to go with this ensemble. And the final thing that it comes down to is the staff. In the film version, it seems like her staff might be made out of metal. It has a strong ringing tone when she slams it on the stone floors.
Listen well, all of you.
And it's a gold color. It has this really beautiful crystal ball type thing on top that is a sort of yellowy lime green tone. And this is not something that I can just walk out and buy. Yes, there are Maleficent staff reproductions, but most of them are either very costumey, meaning that I can go spend almost no money on one from a Halloween store and get something that's basically plastic, or some of the nicer reproduction ones are actually reproduction ones from the Maleficent movies or from The Descendants, not from the original. So I couldn't just find one that resembled her staff in the original film, which meant that I had to make something. And I don't have the ability to necessarily just make a long metal staff with this beautiful curling top and then attach a crystal to the top of it. That is way outside of my realm of knowledge. And I decided for that reason to then go with wood instead, because wood staffs are certainly a common thing in the 15th century. They were used on pilgrimages because as you're trying to ford through streams and make it up mountains, a walking staff, or today we really think of them often as hiking staffs, are incredibly necessary and useful. Or you have the quarterstaffs, which were used in fighting or in sporting situations. So wooden staffs were certainly around, and I figured that might be a good in-between. It's not going to be exactly the same as her staff for obvious reasons, but it's something that I can accomplish because I can find wooden hiking staffs today, and I can make some amendments to the top, and I can find a large crystal ball, and I can attach all of that together. So that is the process that I'm going through for her staff, so it will have the same height and the same feel and weight, even though it won't be out of a metal. It won't be exactly the same appearance. It will be bridging the gap between her actual staff and some of the more historic versions that I could find examples of. So that's what we're going to dig into today. There's not a lot of making time for all of these pieces. Thankfully, this was all just the cleanup and finishing, but I'm going to show you the entire process of getting ready for this final ensemble look as well. I just cannot wait to see this. So I hope you guys are just as excited as I am, and let's dive in. The pattern for the hose seems simple in the leg format, but gets a little complicated around the foot. But the basic measurements are all fairly simple. You're starting off by understanding the length of your leg and where all of the horizontal measurements need to occur. So it's just figuring out how high up you need the hose, how high up your calf is, comparison to that, your ankle, the tip of your toes. I like to bend my knee and point my foot to make sure that I have enough length to do all of these things. And then that's just applied to the body of the hose. And it doesn't really get complicated until we get down to the foot area. When it comes to taking all of the horizontal measurements, I like to move my leg around a little bit, especially when it comes to things like the calf measurement. Some people have calves that expand a lot as they flex and move, and you really need to account for that, along with other issues like bending your thigh, bending your knee, making sure you can comfortably move. When it comes down to the ankle, this is where you need to make a very special note. Don't measure your actual ankle. Measure around the heel of your foot while your toe is pointed, because this is the smallest you can make your ankle and still get your foot through the hose. Yes, the hose is cut on a bias, so that means that it does have a little bit of stretch. It's not going to have a lot, and you don't want to make your ankle really fitted and then not be able to get your foot through. We then can move on to the complicated parts of that bottom part around your foot. I like to check my measurements a few different ways. I want to make sure I know what the overall size of my foot is, so that way I'm sure the foot itself ends up big enough. I also want to know where I want to put that little side gusset. My recommendation is that you make sure that it is far enough forward that the seam doesn't fall directly under the heel of your foot where you're stepping, because you're going to have your center back seam and the seam of the gusset there, and it's going to be a little bumpy, especially if you have a thicker fabric, so you want to make sure that it's far enough forward you won't be standing on it. And that's just for the width of the two outside little ears, if you imagine it as a dog face, as Abby found. The center section can vary in size. You just have to make sure that the piece that goes under the bottom of your foot is large enough to, 1, cover your actual footprint, and 2, make sure that between that and the larger center tab of your hose, that it's big enough to make it around your foot, and this is something you can definitely pin and adjust on your foot. You just need to make sure that it is big enough. When shaping the little flare gusset portions of the part that goes under your foot, the top edge is just the same measurement as the depth of your gusset on the tabs, which I usually measure out to just above my ankle point. I don't go up to the narrowest point of my ankle because that's what you want to keep as narrow as possible, where the flare should occur below for your heel. I also sometimes like to curve this out a little bit, so that way my assumption is that my foot is not always completely flat. I usually have, as I'm sitting or doing other things, a little bit of a relaxed point to it. But that's just me and what I'm comfortable with and how I tend to stand. When you go to cut everything out on the bias, you may find that this takes up a lot of fabric. One of the tips for this is to get used to the idea of piecing. If you put a seam across the leg, which is really only going to run from usually the calf up to the top, this little triangular piece at the top can save you a lot of fabric when you are cutting these out. So yes, it is piecing, and yes, you will have an extra seam there that you have to do and deal with, but it saves you so much yardage. You just have to make sure that both pieces are done on the bias, which mark really well with the triangles. You can easily forget which direction is which. I then like to go ahead and stitch up just around the bottom of the heel, but not up the leg or around the foot. I pin this together and then try the whole thing on, adjusting the pins to see how tight I can make it around the foot, around the calf. I do tend to also take in the ankle a little bit, but I double check that I'm still able to get my foot out really easily since the pins aren't a perfect process. Go ahead and stitch around the foot using a back stitch. I don't go all the way up into the gussets, however. I prefer dealing with these gussets because they are cut slits by working from the outside using a whip stitch. This allows me to essentially whip over that little end of the cut, so that way it doesn't fray out, it doesn't rip or pull. It just makes it a little bit easier, and I tend to do this before I go ahead and finish off the entire thing. Just like you saw with the piecing, my preferred method is to trim back one side of the seam allowance, fold the other over that, and fell it down. This to me creates a very secure seam, especially since these are going to be under a lot of stress. I don't want to just simply open up the seam and whip the edges down. This is a much weaker design. It's a lot better to fold over to one side and stitch it all down again and essentially create two lines of tension. This does mean that with heavier fabrics you do end up with some bulk, which is one of the reasons why it's important to make sure that the place where all of the seams meet up under the heel of the foot is far enough forward that it won't be painful or uncomfortable. Mine was a little bit narrow on that heel section, so I could feel it in this particular pair since it is a pretty heavy wool, but it wasn't painful. I wore them for a few hours and I was okay. I just know in my future versions I'll probably set that a little bit farther forward. The belt itself was a very simple thing. It is just a strip of fabric. I chose to complicate matters just a little bit by doing a velvet back and using a corded silk for the front portion. I figured this would end up creating a really nice depth to the belt when it's just going to be plain black. There's not a lot going on with this, and I just didn't have any ribbons or fabric that was a brocade or metallic that would be appropriate for this that wasn't also antique and likely to not hold up to this much tension. So that was my choice based off of some images that I came across where you could see velvet strips along the edges and a variation between the front and the back textile. Like I mentioned earlier, however, this was not a terribly heavy fabric choice. I thought it would be a little bit more sturdy than it is, but those buckles are just so dense and heavy. I definitely am going to go back and either insert something inside of this tube or possibly use an entirely different textile once I'm able to find something that's more appropriate. But for the moment, I'm just going to go ahead, stitch down both the metal end and the belt buckle to the ends of the fabric belt. I decided to not push the fabric all the way through and whip it over the back side of the buckle, just because I had a limited width of fabric as it was, and I wanted it to be as long as possible. I also made sure that I stitched over every single one of those little round pieces to secure it as well as I possibly could, since it was so heavy I was worried that one thread would break and the whole thing would go. For the last piece, I needed to make up my staff. So I found a place that sold hiking staffs that are completely unfinished, which seemed like a good place to start. I might finish it in the future, but for right now, all I'm doing is cutting it down in height, so that way I'm getting rid of the hole that was drilled through it, and it gets it to a height that's more appropriate to Maleficent's staff, which seemed to be about shoulder height for her. I added a piece to the top, which is just sold as a wooden spool, but it's pretty similar in diameter, so that fits really well. And I had to drill in and cut out little sections in order to put that brass piece in that allows me to screw them together easily and detach them, so that way once I put the large crystal ball on top, I don't have a very long tall stick that needs to be stored carefully with this heavy item on top. For the ball itself, I just needed to carve out a nice rounded concave section in the top of the spool, and then that was glued into place. I thought long and hard about what sort of makeup I was going to do, if any, since historically, obviously, they weren't wearing a ton of makeup, if any. There certainly were things you could do to darken your eyebrows, or rouge up your cheeks or your lips, or powder your face so you had a more even skin tone. Lots of different makeups were available at the time, but there weren't dramatic eyeshadows happening. So I thought about it, and then I decided it just wasn't going to look like Maleficent if there wasn't something. So I tried to find a middle ground between some really extreme makeup and something that looked a little bit creepy but still fairly natural. And then I moved on to getting dressed with my linen smock, which is just sort of a generic squares and triangles shape from that time period. There's nothing really particularly exciting about it. It's just there to make sure that as I sweat, I stay nice and clean, and my clothing and I don't get really smelly. In order to keep the hose from slowly slipping down, even though they are fairly tightly fitted, they will just kind of pull at the ankle. I have a couple of wool tapes that just get tied just below the knee as garters to help keep them up and in place. It works surprisingly well. I then add the shoes to the mix. Those are tied about the ankle so they are nice and secure. The kirtle as well is laced up in front and buttoned along the sleeves and bound at the hem with a wool braid. This particular kirtle is actually made for later in the 15th century, so the neckline of it is particularly wide. This isn't something that would necessarily be true of kirtles in the early 15th century, but since you're not actually going to see the vast majority of this kirtle, and definitely not the neckline, I was less concerned about making an entire new kirtle for this particular project. I do want to go back and do some refitting on my kirtle, especially in the case of the sleeves, but as this was something made a few months ago, it's not high on my priority list at the moment. I have also found that getting in and out of the houppelande is a bit of a trial, as you will see here, as well as at the end of the video. You get to see my escape method. It's definitely something where I could see that being helpful if you had a second person to assist you. It's not impossible, it's just really, really heavy and kind of hard to find exactly where you need to put your head and arms and everything. But then it just drops down into place and is really, actually fairly comfortable to wear, though kind of exhausting. Admittedly, The next day after wearing this for about 3 hours, I felt like I had been working out. I'm really sore. The waist then gets belted up to fit more tightly than I could manage, as the waist needs to be able to fit down over my bust or up over my hips, so it can't be the size of my actual waist. The belt helps tuck that in the rest of the way, and the fullness can either be worked towards the front, the back, or even the sides, depending on what looks best for the silhouette. Admittedly, the only difficulty that I really had in getting dressed came around with the headdress. The hennin itself is very easy to put on, but once you add the weight of the sleeves in the houppelande, the whole thing is rather exhausting, and just the simple act of pinning a little scrap of fabric up around my neck to function as a wimple was really exhausting with that much weight on my arms. I originally wasn't going to add the wimple, so I didn't show any of the process of making something or fitting it, but once I put the whole outfit together, it just felt like it needed it, even though historically I can't find any examples of wimples being worn with houppelans or with double hennins like this. So yes, this is another historical exception because all of these pieces did exist, but not together.